It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum and our continuing series of special programs called Aftermath of the Endless War, in which we're bringing together soldiers, generals, diplomats, and journalists to discuss the decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan and its effects on America, its people, national strategy, and our place in the world. We've been reminded in the last few weeks of just how powerful these questions are to Americans. The new film American Sniper, telling the story of a soldier in Iraq who officially became the most effective sniper in U.S. military history, brought in $200 million at the box office in its first 2 weeks, the most ever for any dramatic film opening, and is clearly destined to become one of the most commercially successful films of all time. No doubt we will be seeing many more such films, books, and other accounts reckoning with this long and complicated era of our national history. Joining us today are retired Army Lieutenant General Daniel BOLGER, the author of Why We Lost, a general's account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and retired Lieutenant Colonel John NAGL, whose recent book is entitled Knife Fights, a memoir of modern war in theory and practice. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks. Good to be here.
It really is remarkable with the film that I just referenced, American Sniper, and in so many other ways. I think that America and Americans are beginning a process of reconsideration of this past decade on many different levels, culturally, policy, militarily, and I think that the two of you have written books that take us into the realm of the commanders, those who actually were tasked with the job of both influencing policy as it related to this, but also ultimately executing it. But military protocol would suggest that the first question in a conversation like this should go to the general at the table. But since you're both retired, and like most Americans, I'm not a military man, I'm going to start with the junior officer here. So Colonel NAGL, what do you think of the title of General BOLGER's book, Why We Lost?
I am not a fan of, I'm a huge fan of Dan BOLGER, the man, Dan BOLGER, the soldier, Dan BOLGER, the historian. An early piece he did, I think when he was still a captain or a major, titled The Ghosts of Omdurman, was a hugely influential piece in my thinking about the future of warfare. I read it when I was a young officer, just back from Operation Desert Storm service in that fight, and so I'm a fan and consider Dan BOLGER to be an intellectual mentor. I disagree with the title of his book. I don't think we've lost either war, either in Iraq or in Afghanistan. I think it's far too early to decide what the final acts are going to be in either of those wars. We are fighting a third Iraq war now, the third Iraq war of my lifetime against ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It's obviously far too soon to see how that is going to come out. So I think that General BOLGER is getting at a feeling of frustration and loss, and I certainly feel those things. I believe that the Iraq War of 2003 was unnecessary, as well as very poorly conducted for the first several years of the war, as well as in the last several years of the second war, the second Iraq the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. We misplayed both the start, invaded unnecessarily, fumbled the first few years, and then pulled out prematurely. I believe that the war in Afghanistan is actually likely to turn out to be reasonably positive, with a very positive outcome for the people of Afghanistan, who are more optimistic about the future of their country than the American people are about the future of our country. Fascinating. So I think it's way too soon to tell, and I actually think that Afghanistan, at least, is going to turn out to be a positive result for the security of the United States.
General, what do you make of that?
Pretty long answer to say that he doesn't think we lost. Hey, I deal in reality, and As a longtime soldier, I learned you got to face the facts, even if they're unpleasant. Look, the enemy insurgency in Iraq is still in the field. We did not defeat it. It was there when we left. Today it's called ISIS. Same guys we were going after. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was on my target list when I was there in 09-10 with the 1st Cav in Baghdad. He's running the show to this day. And that insurgency is still powerful. John, I tell you, having just left Afghanistan 2 years ago, the Taliban's in effective control of the Southwest, the South, and the East. And the people around President Ghani may be very happy about the direction our country's going on. So are the Taliban. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we're doing well in this war. I would like to agree with John that I don't think the war as a whole is a failure yet. We might be able to rescue it. But you pointed out yourself, we're in the 3rd phase in Iraq, and we're against an enemy that waits us out. According to his watch, we've quit twice. I think the ISIS guys are expecting us to quit a 3rd time, and I don't think that's a bad bet. In the case of Afghanistan, our president's already announced we're going to cut our advisory force in half next year and then reduce it to just the embassy. All I can say is I hope they got the helipads marked.
Was there a definition of what victory would have been at the beginning of all of this when you first became involved?
The invasion of Iraq, 2003, unnecessary war, and was predicted to be a cakewalk. The rumor was that we were going to be home by Christmas. The question was which year. There was certainly no expectation that we would be fighting this long, this hard, and I certainly agree with General Bolger that there is still much fighting to be done in Iraq. The causes for this war, these both the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would argue, are campaigns in a larger war against radical Islamic extremism. This war started at least as early as 1993 with the first bombing of the World Trade Center, obviously exploded literally on September 11th, 2001. The initial attacks on Afghanistan, on the Taliban in Afghanistan, were designed to defeat, destroy al-Qaeda in that country. And to that extent, certainly they have succeeded. Al-Qaeda no longer an effective force either in Afghanistan nor, I would argue, in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda Central. That organization has morphed, and the fighting in Iraq continues. Unlike General Bolger, I believe that we will defeat the Islamic State in Iraq. I am less confident about the Islamic State in Syria. That's a very interesting and much more difficult question. But so the end state in these kind of wars is a stable government that in the local country that can defeat the continuing challenge of an insurgency largely under its own power, with the assistance of external powers like the United States, largely providing advisors, air power, intelligence, some of the higher end assets. I believe we will have American troops both in Iraq and Afghanistan for decades to come. And I actually believe that that is part of the definition of success in these kinds of wars.
Do you buy that?
Yeah, it'll be stable in the same way that the EKJ of a dead guy is stable. I mean, the government there is an effective ally of Iran, okay? Haider al-Abadi, yeah, he's a better guy than Maliki, but his Minister of Interior, Gabin, that guy is a member of the Badr Corps, a pro-Iranian militia. That's the head of your police service in Iraq. As you know, John, as I think most folks know, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has advisors also on the ground. Some estimates say they might have as many as we do. We have around 3,000 or so, give or take. They have some as well with various tribal militia units. Look, that is a fractured state. As I said, we left an insurgency in the field when we left there in 2011. I do agree with John that it's a long-term effort in both countries, and both countries really, if they're going to have any hope at all, they've got to have a continued American commitment. But it's noteworthy when we talk about an American commitment. We have no security treaty with either country. We have agreements that are initialed by our ambassador. The very able Ryan Crocker negotiated both agreements, a wonderful diplomat. But an agreement negotiated by your ambassador and signed by him has the diplomatic credibility of signing a cocktail napkin. The U.S. could get rid of it tomorrow, and the enemy knows that in both countries. They believe that we will not stick with it. They figure one more electoral cycle, one more bad incident, and the United States will pull. If we're serious about doing something to remedy these egregious mistakes made in this conflict, we got to make a long-term commitment to these countries, and that does not take hundreds of thousands of Americans. I will tell you that an American-led counterinsurgency, we've tried 3 of them in my lifetime, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, that is a loser. A counterinsurgency led by the local people, as John's said, as he's written about, as he's advocated for a long time, led by the local people with us helping, that could work. But it's a very long-term prospect. We're talking decades. And I personally think the American people have got to be asked about that, which is to say there needs to be a public debate, there needs to be a recorded vote, and the military has to be prepared for the fact that the American people may say, no, don't do it.
Now, Colonel, you agree with that largely, don't you?
Hugely. The only purpose of a war is to build a better peace. And we entered a war in Afghanistan that was absolutely necessary and that should have been fought and broadly speaking succeeded. We should have killed Osama bin Laden much earlier. There were insufficient troops on the ground early in the Afghanistan war, but we did succeed in expelling, in causing the Taliban to fall, expelling al-Qaeda into Pakistan, and ultimately, I would argue, effectively defeated them there with a very effective drone war, and then should have consolidated in Afghanistan, conducted a nation-building, a state-building exercise, rather, to build the institutions of government that were necessary for Afghanistan to thrive and flourish. And we could have done that over the long term with very few troop losses and created a stable Afghanistan. Instead, we prematurely and on incorrect information and unnecessarily and stupidly, but other than that, it was a great idea, invaded Iraq in 2003, taking resources away from stability in Afghanistan, and with no plan for what to do in Iraq after having toppled Saddam Hussein's government. General Bolger is absolutely correct. The big winner of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 was Iran. Yep. We should have seen that coming. Iraq was a natural counterweight to Iran. We weakened Iraq and strengthened Iran. A gross error, a critical error. Ironically, we are now cooperating with Iran in the fight against the Islamic State inside Iraq and Syria, an extraordinary turn of events that has potential to reshape American foreign policy in the Middle East in some really interesting ways. But the failure to plan for a long-term commitment in both Iraq and Afghanistan has put us in a much worse position than we need to be, has led to the deaths of friends of both Dan's and mine, and will lead to the deaths of more of them, Afghans, Iraqis, and Americans, that didn't need to happen because we failed to properly plan for this thing and follow through.
First, what the U.S. did right in both wars, we're very good at the conventional phase of the wars. The Afghan war, the initial fight against the Taliban and to go after al-Qaeda, the original centralized al-Qaeda, the guys who attacked us on 9/11, that was very effectively prosecuted in a few weeks in the fall and early winter of 2001.
The good war.
Well, a good war in the sense that it accomplished American tasks, knocked out the Taliban, put al-Qaeda on the run, made them unable to conduct the kind of attacks that hit our country on 9/11, that had gone after the embassies in Africa in 1998, that had bombed the destroyer USS Cole in the Aden Harbor in 2000. That was done in 2001, and it was done very effectively using special ops, intel forces, and air power. We then re-roll that. Again, the wisdom of going or not going against Iraq, leave that aside for a second. I'll come back to that. But the operation of going after Saddam's military in the spring of 2003, again, very effective. The U.S. military, all volunteer military, the great men and women that John and I have had the privilege to serve with, they are trained, organized, and equipped for rapid, decisive warfare. With them in the lead, they'll destroy any conventional force you put them against. But if you want to leave them in there to build a country, you got to reconfigure that force. And it should not be hundreds of thousands of Americans, tanks, jet fighters, and all that. It's got to be much more of a constabulary force, smaller in number, configured for a long-term relation with the local forces in the lead. It was that transition that I think we fumbled the ball.
Before we go any further, one thing I want to make a point of here is that both of you are eminently qualified to disagree or agree with each other. General Bolger served in the Army for 35 years, highly decorated, earned 3 Bronze Stars, Combat Action Badge, multiple commands in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Iraq, you led a division at one point of 20,000 troops. Colonel NAGL attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, also awarded the Bronze Star, tank platoon commander in the first invasion of Iraq, co-author of the Army Field Manual on counterinsurgency that is more often attributed solely to General David Petraeus. You both express frustration in your books and here with how things turned out with high-level military and strategic leadership. What does all of that say about the quality of U.S. military leadership, the competence of our generals, and are the frustrations that you express widely held?
I'm a general, so I'll tell you right now. I think I screwed up this war. I know I did. The commander's responsible in the U.S. Army for everything his unit does or fails to do. And my units failed in their basic mission to win these 2 campaigns. And I had key roles. I was a general officer in both theaters in command. I think my fellow generals bear a share of that. And that is separate from political responsibility. Talk about that in a second. But militarily, that was my job. And it was my job that if I couldn't do it with the resources available, which includes time, because we never really made it clear how long we were going to stay, how much we were committed, not being able to do that, I owed it to the political people, the people in civilian clothes that I worked for, to go back to them and say, hey, this is not going to work unless you give us more time or you sign a treaty or do that. I didn't do that.
Why not?
Partially, I think, because of how well the wars had started. And my absolute trust in our great all-volunteer military. In a way, I knew what had happened in Vietnam. I'd studied it, but I almost thought, hey, this time we're going to get it right. We're going to stick with this. We've got great men and women. They're sorting things out on the ground. Guys like John, where he was between Ramadi and Fallujah, a very tough area. His unit was a tank battalion, but they reconfigured themselves to do counterinsurgency and train Iraqi forces. That was happening in both countries all over. But here's the warning. Good tactical fights and things like that do not a victory make. What we needed was a national commitment and a strategic discussion, and that's on the generals. And I can tell you, speaking for this general, I didn't get it right.
You're shaking your head.
So Dan Bolger is being too hard on himself, and that's my job. So I'm pretty disappointed in him for being so unnecessarily and incorrectly. He's assigning responsibilities to himself that he did not have. But I completely agree with this last point, right? So in both wars, in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, national strategy has been deeply flawed. And the American people should be very, very angry. A whole bunch of kids have died, great kids have died, because our politicians did not think this bad boy through.
Nor did our generals.
And I am also hard on some of our generals, not as hard as Dan is. I completely agree that our Army was unprepared for the demands of counterinsurgency both in Iraq and Afghanistan. After Desert Storm, as Dan Bolger wrote, we needed to prepare for a different kind of war, for policing empires. There was no, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the rapid defeat of the Iraqi army. We took the 4th largest army in the world to the 2nd largest army in Iraq in a period of 100 hours. I was privileged to be a part of that fight. Right? We were really, really good at that. Nobody was ever going to fight us that way again. We failed to adapt as an army, as a Department of Defense, as a nation for the changed strategic circumstance in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I put enormous blame on our military for, from 1991 to 2001, not adapting for the kind of wars that we've actually had to fight. We had to do that adaptation on the fly. That cost us lives, it cost us time, it cost us dollars. Right? And so I'm very critical of the military and the generals, and it was their responsibility to prepare the military for those wars. But Dan Bolger was one of the guys telling them to do it at career risk to himself. Enormous intellectual courage in a piece he wrote in 1991, published in 1991. However, the generals don't make national policy. They don't decide what countries to invade. They don't decide how many troops to put in. And some of them, and I'm thinking in particular of Marine Lieutenant General Dan Newbold, who was arguing with Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld about the number of troops required to secure Iraq, to defeat Saddam Hussein, but more importantly, to secure the rumored weapons of mass destruction sites. Greg Newbold went repeatedly to Secretary Rumsfeld and said, you need this many troops. Rumsfeld continued to decrease the number. Newbold eventually resigned, stepped down as a 3-star general, an extraordinary act of military courage, because he believed that going any further down, cutting that number of troops, would have been dangerous to mission accomplishment and would have cost more lives than were necessary. Newbold was right, Rumsfeld was wrong.
But General, you call in your book, you praise lieutenant colonels and the officers on the ground who are actually the tactical sorting things out. But you refer to the leadership above them, presumably the person just described. You refer to the generals and the higher level leadership of the military as a yowling waste.
Yeah, actually to their actions and inactions. I think it's mostly inaction. The military left to itself will operate. They will carry out the tasks that they carry out. And General Newbold was an example that was given there, but what effect did that action have? None. General Rick Shinseki, the Chief of Staff of the Army, testified in front of Congress that it would take several 100,000 soldiers to secure Iraq. As a result of that, he was the Chief of Staff of the Army, the senior guy in Army uniform. He was ignored. I mean, not only ignored, Secretary Rumsfeld made sure to name his replacement a year and a half before he left office to make sure that he was essentially a lame duck as the Army chief. I think generals have a responsibility to do that, but those two guys were in the Pentagon. What about the field commanders? What did they do or not do? And incrementally, you think you're doing better. What you don't realize is there's a clock running back in the United States. And you've never had the discussion with the American people. How long are you willing to stay? How many lives are you willing to pay while we, as John said, sort of reinvent ourselves to do this task? Moreover, the other thing you have to ask yourself, no matter how good the American conventional military gets at counterinsurgency, every well we dig, every school we build, every mayor we train is another well not dug, school not built, or person not trained by the local government, which means in a way we're undermining the guys who are supposed to be getting the support of the villagers. We're not going to be an imperial power. We're not going to do that. And because we're not going to treat places like Iraq and Afghanistan as the 51st and 52nd state, in my mind, if we're going to go in there and do counterinsurgency, we've got to put the local people in charge, drastically reduce our strength in terms of footprint, activities, and accept the fact that you're going to get an imperfect outcome. But to me, an imperfect outcome beats 2 lost campaigns and a lot of dead Americans.
We all understood this notion of the surge. I don't think we completely understood the counterinsurgency element of it. I think we thought it was just doing a better job. But very succinctly, describe to us what the cornerstone idea of counterinsurgency was.
The basic principle of counterinsurgency is to protect the population first. So that in conventional war, in Desert Storm, I shot the tanks that didn't look like me and shot the soldiers who were wearing uniforms different than mine, and we won. And we were phenomenally good at that. The world paid attention and decided, instead of putting on uniforms so they know who to shoot, let's hide among the people. Let's fight as insurgents and terrorists. Mao's phrase, they are fish swimming in the sea of the people. And then the hard part in conventional war, the hard part isn't finding your enemy, he makes himself obvious, it's killing him, and he makes himself hard to kill. In irregular warfare, the hard part is figuring out who your enemy is. Once you figure out who the enemy is, it's very easy to remove them from the battlefield. And so the central insight of the counterinsurgency field manual that I helped write was that if you protect the population, if you make the population secure in their homes, then they will identify the insurgents for you, and they may even start fighting them themselves. And that is what happened, I would argue, as a result of the surge, as a result of the implementation of new counterinsurgency principles, as a result of the Sunnis in Iraq, in Al Anbar, where both Dan and I fought, recognizing that al-Qaeda in Iraq, the primary enemy we were fighting there, was unbelievably evil, unspeakably evil, and the Sunnis actually rose up and fought against them in what is called the Sawa, or the Awakening, flipping our enemies to become our friends, cooperating with them against our common enemy. And that, I would argue, was the decisive event of the second Iraq war of my lifetime, the 2003 to 2011 war.
Now, General Bolger, you in your comments today, you have seemed to some degree affirm the general idea of some of what was just described. But in terms of what actually happened in Iraq, you say that the field manual, quote unquote, played very well to academics and journalists and the public, but that it meant nothing to a platoon sergeant actually fighting the insurgency. And you are harshly critical of General Petraeus. I mean, you seem to view him primarily as a kind of public relations fiction almost.
Well, in his own mind, no doubt. Listen, counterinsurgency, the principles that John's described, he studied them. His book, Learn and Eat Soup with a Knife, was put out with a foreword by the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Pete Schoonmaker, a longtime special ops officer, for all of us to read and learn from it. The principles are fine, and they do work, but it's got to be the local people in charge. You talked about the Sawa, that's exactly right, the Sunni Awakening. Those people trusted us when we sent in our surge force that we would continue to work with those Sunni Arabs. But here's the challenge with the surge, and whether it's led by a very brilliant general like David Petraeus or a more pedestrian guy like me, by definition, a surge is like a wave coming up on the beach. So it comes up on the beach, and then it leaves, and the beach sand's still there. By definition, we're against an enemy that has an endless time clock. They live there. And so, by surging, in a way, we told them we're only going to do this for a certain amount of time. We put a clock on ourselves. We sent people in, tried to do it. In theory, behind that surge, we should have built a local security force that could have held. But the local Sunni Arabs that we built behind that trusted the Americans, not the Iranian-dominated Shia government in Baghdad. When we left and drew down that Iranian-dominated Shia government in Baghdad and the Sunni Arabs went back at it, and unfortunately, many members of the Sawa that John and I served with and that we worked side by side are now de facto working, at least tolerating ISIS, if not working for them. Not because they love ISIS or the Al-Qaeda belief system or anything like that, but because they felt abandoned by the Americans. A surge, by its definition, in my view, in these kind of wars is temporary, and temporary measures, back to Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong told his guerrillas in China when they were fighting the Japanese, enemy advances, we retreat. Enemy retreats, we advance. And that's exactly what we've already seen in Iraq. We will see the same thing in Afghanistan starting this spring.
How does that make both of you feel, just what you referred to just now, the idea that there are people who you knew, whose names you know, who you worked with, presumably had some degree of personal connection to, who are now fighting on the other side?
This is all enormously frustrating because it didn't need to happen. There was no American political pressure to withdraw all American forces from Iraq at the end of 2011, as President Obama decided to do, against the advice of his Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, best Secretary of Defense we've ever had, Hillary Clinton, a great Secretary of State, and I think Petraeus was the CENTCOM commander at that time, all recommended keeping a long-term advisory presence in Iraq, as Dan Bolger and I both agree was absolutely necessary. Had that happened, this third Iraq war would not be happening. Those American troops would have solidified the Iraqi security forces that both Dan and I helped train, and importantly, the American presence in Iraq, continuing presence in Iraq, would have served as a counterweight against the sectarian influences of al-Maliki, the Shiite and very closely linked to the Iranians, Prime Minister of Iraq. So none of this needed to happen. These kids, these Iraqi kids, Iraqi young men didn't need to die. These Iraqi women didn't need to be sold into sexual slavery. For a very small additional effort, the United States could have prevented this from happening. And that is what is so frustrating. Having done 99% of the work, having taken the ball to the 1-yard line, we fumbled the ball at the 1-yard line, and we just dropped it. We weren't even hit. There was no pressure forcing the United States to withdraw.
Do you accept that, General Bolger, that you were at the 1-yard line, really? And then you just dropped the ball?
We were at the 1-yard line, but we dropped the ball back in our locker room, from what I could tell. Listen, that's a nice narrative, John. That's a good narrative, but I was over there late in the war, and I'm going to tell you this. There was still an active insurgency in the battlefield. They were killing our guys in 09, 10, and 11. All the people you mentioned did advocate that. President Obama did not pull out every single force. In fact, what he did was carry out the agreement that was made by Ambassador Ryan Crocker in December of 2008, which, as I do the math, that was the Bush administration. The agreement's title was the Agreement on the Withdrawal of U.S. Forces from Iraq. Now, that's the English translation. Maybe the Arabic read a little bit kinder. But, you know, when I read a document that says I'm going to withdraw from Iraq, why should I be surprised when I then withdraw from Iraq? That's what we said we were going to do, and it sent the date of 31 December 2011. Bipartisan, both agreed with it. And there was a thought, military guys like me, John, others, General Petraeus, oh, he doesn't really mean this. He's going to leave a whole division over there. I was in the Army leadership, and we were planning to leave a division of forces, maybe 10,000 troops, over in Iraq as late as the fall of 2011. Now, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. I agree with you that there wasn't a lot of stomach for that in the White House. Things had settled down a lot in Iraq, so there was a thought that maybe there was an opportunity. The Iraqis were being kind of stupid about what kind of agreements they'd give in terms of protection from prosecution under Iraqi law. That could have all been worked around. What was left? There were over 200 uniform advisors left there under the command of a lieutenant general, and over 4,000 contractors at 10 separate bases working with Iraqi forces. And that was all in place up until this spring when we began to put U.S. forces back in. On paper, we say, oh, we pulled everybody out. But the reality was you had almost 5,000 Americans, 200 in uniform. The contractors are all former military and intel and law enforcement guys that were over there carrying out a training mission. It was incomplete. It was inadequate, and it obviously didn't work. But I think we got to be very, very careful to buy into this narrative of sort of, yeah, we were winning the war and then we were stabbed in the back by the hippies at home or something like that. That's a bunch of crap, okay?
Hey, Colonel, I'll go back to your earlier discussion of how the American people should have signed on to a plan, or even today should sign on to a plan. I mean, the one time that the American people did speak in an election at a moment in time when there was a strategy to be adopted, it was the election of 2008, and the American people seemed to support the guy who was saying, I'm going to fulfill that plan and get our troops out.
So the initial mistakes were all made in the initial invasion of 2003. We invaded a country we didn't need to invade. We did it badly. We did it with insufficient troops who were not trained in counterinsurgency. We had no plan for the post-war era. The adoption of a counterinsurgency strategy in 2007, I argue, turned around a war that was going rapidly south, and all you have to do is look at the casualty figures to see, or the political stability figures to see how that war changed and how the adoption of counterinsurgency strategy led to the Sawa, encouraged the Sawa, and the rapid change of the course of that war in Iraq. The American people were deeply disappointed by the course of the war in Iraq in the midterms of 2006. They turned out both houses of Congress, right, both flipped from Republican to Democrat. If we were a civilized country and had a parliament like every other civilized country in the world, the government would have fallen. Because we have a presidential system, George Bush was able to make the bravest decisions of his presidency, and I argue the best foreign policy decisions of his presidency, replacing his Secretary of Defense and his commander in Iraq. He replaced Rumsfeld with Gates, General Casey, a good man, with Dave Petraeus, who changed the course of that war. That combination of Gates, Petraeus with the support of George Bush changed the course of that war. Barack Obama campaigned on Iraq as a bad war, Afghanistan as the good war, had campaigned on getting all American troops out of Iraq without understanding, speaking very respectfully of the president, of not understanding the fact that American wars have a long tail, right? We still have American troops in Germany, Italy, and Japan 70 years after the end of World War II. We still have American troops in Korea. Dan and I have both done service there. We still have American troops in the former Yugoslavia 25 years after that war. If ground is important enough to sanctify it with the blood of our sons and daughters, it is important enough to keep American troops there for the long haul, to keep whatever political situation necessitated the spilling of that blood from breaking out again. Had we left those American troops there, we would not now be fighting in the third Iraq war of my lifetime, after we succeed in expelling the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria from that country, which I expect to happen in the next 18 months. If we leave a long-term American security presence there, we will not have to fight a fourth Iraq war in my lifetime, inshallah, God willing.
It's important in a conversation like this that we not just dissect the corpse, but that we also try to
Which is still kicking, damn it.
Some of them are. But to also talk about either what's the alternative in a more specific sort of way, or how might we approach a similar situation in the future like the one you're describing. But so, General Bulger, would you agree with regardless of how things got to this place, would you agree with that general premise that you didn't seem to a minute ago, that in 2011, when things appeared most stable, that if there had been a good sort of political transaction and translation in the United States, if the president or someone else had made a case for actually let's back up, let's keep a big group of soldiers here for a long time, let's actually go into a West Germany kind of mode and have big bases and tens of thousands of soldiers, would that have...
No, I think that would have been a mistake. I mean, tens of thousands was the mistake to begin with. Maybe about a division's worth of ground troops and some air squadrons, 10, 15,000. I think General Austin, Lloyd Austin was the commander then. I think he recommended 20 to 25,000, counting the Air Force, the intel guys, special ops and everything. Yeah, a reasonable number, relatively small, and bases isolated from the Iraqi population where they could train out in the desert and do that would have worked. There's no doubt. But I would remind, again, John and I have both, since we both have studied insurgency, counterinsurgency, we've invoked the name of Mao Zedong. Remember what Mao says with the guerrillas: enemy advances, we retreat. The surge was our advance. We put in Iraqi forces behind us. Naturally, you'd expect when the enemy advances, ISIS retreats. Had we followed up then with some type of longer-term relationship, that enemy retreat might have been held in place. But when we definitely drew down and publicly announced that, pulled troops out, even though we did leave advisors and contractors and thought we had a relationship, that's where you get ISIS. I mean, it springs up in that vacuum. You know, enemy retreats, we advance. The guerrillas had not been defeated. And this goes to one of the challenges. As successful as the surge was in the short term, it did not defeat the insurgency. It did not destroy it. It probably was unable to in the 18, 24 months that it was doing. It just couldn't. And so as a result, not unlike we fumbled the transition from the opening conventional fight to the counterinsurgency, we also fumbled the transition from the surge to the long-term counterinsurgency. And in that regard, guys like myself, who were over there fighting at that time, generals like General Petraeus, guys like both President Bush's administration and President Obama did not take advantage of the surge. And I might add, not only that, they then repeated the error by running a surge in Afghanistan that was even less successful because why? By that time, the enemy had seen the pattern and they knew we weren't going to stay.
So that's one alternative scenario that could have played out, might have had a different outcome. Let me just ask you, in your General Bulger, in your book, you make the point that we could have pulled out of Afghanistan and Iraq in 2003 or 2004, similar to how we've done it now, and achieved the same, as you would describe, dismal results that we've got presently.
Yeah, basically, if all you want is two messed up countries, we had that already by March of 2003 and by December 2001. The point is, what's the purpose of the American operations in both countries? The purpose of American operations, I don't believe we're an imperial power. I don't think the United States citizenry has ever signed up for that. And it bugs me to even hear you say that. And I'm not in for that. That's not why I joined the Army. And I will tell you, in my view, why did we go in there? We went into Afghanistan because of the attacks in 9/11. Once we had defeated Al-Qaeda, messed them up so they couldn't do a follow-on attack. We weren't good at manhunting yet, so we didn't find bin Laden. That took a while to develop those skills. The drones and all this other stuff came later. But once we'd knocked them and their Taliban sponsors out, at that point, the effective response to 9/11 was over. And as much as I love the Afghan people, I have served alongside them bravely, and the Iraqi people the same way. I've helped them when they've been wounded. I've done all that stuff, and I've seen them die. And believe me, if you talk about who's lost this war, the Iraq and Afghan people have lost this war big time and are continuing to lose this war. But that said, the American interest was solved by about December of 2001, January of 2002. We should have declared victory, left it to the Afghans to sort it out, and be done with it.
And John, I want you to respond to that, but I want to add to this. Partly, I think this is a version of what you're describing, General Bulger. Another alternative would have been, as you say in Afghanistan, go in, destroy the Taliban as best we can, preferably track down and kill Osama bin Laden. And in Iraq, leaving aside the errors of fact and such that preceded it, another scenario would have been to go in until Baghdad fell, be there until Saddam Hussein was found in his bunker, put a bullet in his head, tell the Iraqi people, don't let bad people like this run your country again, and leave. And a lesson would have been left behind in both countries. That's a much more imperial policing, brutal
action.
But should that be the way? If we can't do 50-year commitments, if we can't win these kinds of conflicts, should the United States simply punish our enemies and then go back home?
So I absolutely deny the premise that we can't do 50-year commitments, and I've already pointed out that we've done a number of them. American troops are stationed around the globe to preserve the peace, to create the conditions for economic commerce, to promote economic development. We are doing what empires do. And so I absolutely deny the premise that we couldn't leave 15,000, 20,000 American troops both in Iraq and in Afghanistan forever. I think that would be good for Iraq, it'd be good for Afghanistan, it'd be good for stability in those regions, good for the United States. What happens when we topple a government and leave is something we've seen in Libya. We left prematurely in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's affiliate, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, came back in. Dan and I agree strongly, if we leave at the end of next year of 2016, the Taliban will come back into Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda will gain strength. And they're already there, but they'll come back in strength and come back more openly, and Al-Qaeda will be back there, and we're going to have to go fight again. So we've already gotten this thing to a reasonable point that with a long-term American investment of 20,000 or so folks, we can maintain stability in those regions. We can preserve in Afghanistan a long-term intelligence base for looking into and, if necessary, conducting operations inside Pakistan, which I consider to be the most dangerous state on the globe for U.S. interests. It is hugely in America's interest to have bases in Iraq and Afghanistan forever, and it will cost us very little to do so. I see no reason not to do that.
If you're going to do these type of stationing and put 20,000 guys in Iraq or Afghanistan, 20,000 men and women, then have the public debate, as we did on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Treaty, as we did on the 1954 treaty with Korea, and have a recorded vote. That is the way our Constitution works. Don't sign the American people up for imperial policing on a cocktail napkin and an agreement on deals cut, at Foggy Bottom or in the Pentagon or in the White House Executive Office building. Have the public debate. And the military needs to be ready if the public debate is no. We do not want to do anything more in that part of the country.
I believe the primary strategic lesson of the attacks of September 11th, the primary strategic principle of the United States in the long war against radical Islamic extremism, the war formerly known as the Global War on Terror, is never again allow a base from which radical Islamic extremists can plan, conduct, and conduct attacks on the United States of America and our friends and allies around the globe. And I believe a long-term investment of 15,000 American troops will prevent that from happening in Afghanistan and will make that less likely in Pakistan. And Dan Bolger has been very critical of our generals, but the mistakes he keeps talking about are not generals' mistakes. The generals have gone on record and said, this is what we need to do. Our politicians have made other choices. Some have. Fair point, right? But a number of generals, I think, have acquitted themselves well in the political, and almost all of them have acquitted themselves in the military fight, but they have acquitted themselves well in the political fight. I believe that our politicians completely agree that we should have a national debate about Iraq and Afghanistan. The Congress should be taking votes on this, right? That's not the military's job.
Well, I don't know that our politicians agree with it, since as near as I can tell, 2002 was the last vote. If you leave aside the 2007 hearings where Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus came back, and that got quite a bit of attention and coverage in September 2007, other than that, it's handled as routine business, much akin to funding the National Park Service, mowing the lawn in front of the Capitol, things like that. I mean, we're talking about sending thousands of young Americans in as policing forces around the world. In my view, we've got to follow our Constitution, have a public debate, and have votes on these matters. It cannot be just something handled under a giant omnibus bill, tucked in behind, naming the post office for the guy who just contributed to your campaign.
And I couldn't agree more with that, but that's not the fault of the generals.
There were 2,400 dead in Afghanistan, 4,500 dead in Iraq, Americans, 30,000 injured in Iraq, at least 100,000 civilians killed in Iraq, probably many, many more than that. So the stakes are very high, as you were just saying.
3,000 Americans almost killed on 9/11 here in our own country.
Yeah. You both recount a good many war stories in both the books. General Bolger, you talk about the loss of 80 men under your command.
76 men and 4 women in 3 tours that were my troops that were killed in the war.
What was the hardest day in your command?
The hardest day for me was the end of June 2009. In a 36-hour period, I had 5 soldiers killed, 4 in a single incident from the 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team of the North Carolina National Guard, all guys in one truck blown up by an IED. In another case, I had a battalion commander, both his legs chopped off by a explosively formed projectile that shot through the side of his armored truck. When they were returning after the weather was bad, we couldn't get air up, so he couldn't be medevac. When they were returning back from the hospital, a staff sergeant who was on his security team was killed by gunshot as they were fighting through a roadblock. That happened in a very short period of time. What's particularly distressing about that is officially on June 30th, 2009, according to the security agreement of December 2008, the U.S. forces were quote unquote out of the cities, and Nouri al-Maliki had a giant countdown clock running in the central area of Baghdad and had a celebration of his victory. And he wasn't talking about the victory over the insurgents who just killed those guys and had killed several Iraqis in those fights as well. He's talking about his victory over his American allies, by whose sufferance he drew breath. And I'll never forget that, because we were fighting in Baghdad. And by the way, I might add, we continued to fight in Baghdad, even though we were quote unquote out of his city. But it was an example of, in my mind, of the stuff that went on in that war, and it's a day I won't forget.
Colonel, you describe an acquaintance.
Yeah, that was Captain Matt August, West Point class of probably 97, 98. A horrible day. We just had a memorial service in the morning for a couple of kids who'd been killed by an IED, and after the memorial service, Matt and his First Sergeant Hoffman, headed off to. We were doing good counterinsurgency work. They were an engineer unit. They were looking for weapons. They were prospecting and taking weapons off the battlefield, weapons that had been left scattered across the battlefield because we had insufficient troops in the initial invasion of Iraq. Lieutenant General Greg Newbold's argument to Don Rumsfeld. And so it was a supermarket of weapons and explosives littered across Iraq in 2003 and 2004. And Matt August, God bless him, First Sergeant Hoffman, their guys were going out to pick them up and bring them back so they could be destroyed. And literally leaving the memorial service, an improvised explosive device tore apart the vehicle Matt and Top Hoffman were in and killed them both. And Matt's wife was an Army officer, West Point graduate, fellow West Point graduate, who stayed in theater and continued to fight. Right, so many bad days, so much courage, so much bravery. The kids, the young men and women who have, particularly the ones who have volunteered since September 11th to join our military, knowing that they're going to go to war, I would argue are far more brave than the two of us who signed up in a time of peace, right? And so what the American people need to know is their sons and daughters are doing everything the country has asked of them and things the country has no business asking of them. They deserve better leadership in Washington from both parties. They deserve the national debate that Dan Bolger is calling for.
Well, I bring those stories out not to be maudlin, but to ask the question or make the observation that we live in a country in which General Petraeus himself is forced out of a leadership position because of a personal indiscretion. We impeached a president because of a personal infidelity. There's been a lot of talk in our country about impeaching a current president over a pitched and important policy debate, but discussion of impeachment of a president for that. And yet, and I don't say this as a partisan observation at all, but yet the two of you describe a kind of nightmare of poor decision making, of bad information, bad strategy, lack of resources, ignoring the most qualified advisors. I mean, you're describing, if you're correct, a kind of catastrophic failure of leadership. And yet, in our country, and I think it's because we don't allow ourselves to say things like why we lost. We can't sort of tolerate the idea of an American failure. And so we end up never having the debate before these actions, and we never have an accountability discussion like, should this person still be president of the United States after making a sequence of decisions like that?
Well, Doug, you used a key term there, accountability. And I believe in the military, guys like John and I were taught when we do an operation, after the operation, you get together and you do an after-action review. And it's good, bad, or indifferent. We always say, be thick-skinned, talk about what you did right, what you did wrong. Again, back to our old friend Mao Zedong, they would recognize it as the old guerrilla self-criticism section. And that's important. We need to have a self-criticism session in our country. You know, we had a pretty good examination of what happened at 9/11 with the bipartisan 9/11 Commission. Where's the commission on this war? I haven't been called in front of any congressional hearing to ask, what I did or didn't do. I don't recall any of these folks called in. And we need to hear from more than just the people in uniform. We need to hear from our diplomats, our intel service, our political leaders. I think that needs to happen, especially when you consider, as John has warned us, we're already in a third phase in the Iraq war and probably fixing to start another phase in Afghanistan. Our enemies are not going to wait while we ignore this problem. And I agree with you. There needs to be accountability, and it needs to be public. We shouldn't hide behind security and, that's classified and American. Hey, I worked for the American people when I was in uniform. And my bosses, my real bosses, were the citizenry of the United States. They have a right to have an accounting of what we did or didn't do with the mission they gave us.
And I completely agree with that. And although I disagree with Dan's title, I commend him for choosing that title because it is starting this conversation that very much needs to have. And we need to learn from the extraordinary price we paid of our sons and daughters, the best our country has. Their blood is crying out from the soil of Iraq and Afghanistan. Don't make these mistakes again. I'll sign up to do what my country needs, but for God's sake, make better decisions next time. Build the army we're going to need before the war, not during the course of it. Have a plan for what's going to happen after you topple the government so that we can build a better peace so that we don't have to come back here and do it again. They deserve that, and that will only happen if the American people scream for that to happen.
I bring this up very respectfully. How do you react to former Vice President Cheney very recently being asked about all the things you're talking about, the invasion of Iraq, and his response was, I believed in it then, I look back on it now, it was absolutely the right thing to do.
I'm glad he's very forthright. I'd like to see him in front of that bipartisan committee and under cross-examination from somebody who's not going to throw them softballs.
I find that the most ridiculous and appalling statement an elected leader of our country has said in many years. Other than that,
And General, you were executing orders in a sense. You were playing out the strategy. But what were you thinking internally at the time? When Shinseki went before Congress and said we're going to need several 100,000 soldiers to hold this place down, and then the administration is essentially pushing him away?
I think the one thing people should be aware of, though, in the military you do follow orders, but behind the door you do give your honest opinion. And I was able to say very honest things. John had his chances, he said as well. I was able to tell Secretaries of Defense, Secretaries of State, both vice presidents in both administrations. I talked to both of them at length, to include the gentleman you quoted, what I thought about where we were in the war, and I was not sanguine on it. I was very concerned about our lack of a long-term commitment in either country, and I believe that 100,000 Americans sort of wandering around Baghdad or Kabul looking through trash heaps for IEDs was not the road to success. That the road to success involved something I also was involved in, and that's training the local people and understanding that although they're going to do it their way, you should listen to them and you should help them and let them take the lead. And gradually we work toward that. We still haven't got it quite right. But here's an important point. You say all those things with the door closed. Now the door opens. The policymaker or the commanding general comes out and says, this is what we're doing. You have two choices at that point. You can execute those orders and do the best you can with the resources you have available, or you can resign. And you mentioned General Newbold, Lieutenant General Greg Newbold, United States Marine Corps, who on the Joint Staff came to that choice and did elect to resign. I did not elect to resign.
In hindsight, would you?
I don't think it would have made any difference.
I sense at least that in the narrative of this conversation that we hear the most about now, there is a version of it, maybe the most common version of it, that seems to put forth the idea that it came as a surprise the way things went badly in Iraq, as if this was something that had not actually been predicted. When the reality is that we've already referred to Shinseki, who said it's going to take hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Kofi Annan at the UN specifically said this is an illegal action. We had people like Scott Ritter, the weapons inspector, who was coming out almost a year before the invasion began, saying there are no weapons of mass destruction. I'm an authority on this. I mean, there were all kinds of people, and you even had General Zinni, who was by then already retired, but who had run this war game, Desert Crossing, 4 years earlier, in which he'd come up with a conclusion that what would happen in this situation was exactly what did happen. So how is it that there's any credence at all to the idea that this whole thing wasn't forecast in explicit terms?
it was forecast in explicit terms. Nobody listened.
I'm one of those people, and that's what I do take ownership of. And I'm going to tell you why. Because believe so strongly in the great men and women of the all-volunteer force, saw the effective operations in Afghanistan in 2001 and the quick knockout of the Taliban and Central Al-Qaeda, and believed that this time we were going to be able to do it in such a way that it was going to work. And arrogance is a very powerful and blinding factor, but it's just as dangerous. And you know, the Greeks had the old thing, you know, that said, first you succeed, then the hubris builds up, and then it leads to nemesis. That is what the sequence we've seen in the war. John's right, it didn't have to be this way, but I got to tell you, it was a lot more than just a few policymakers. It was the institutions of these organizations, almost to a man and woman, up and down the chain that expected this. And I will tell you, that's where we got it wrong. And I think we have to ask ourselves, before we go into these countries, are we in such a rush that we can't talk to the experts, that we can't look at the history of the region? So these things should not come as a surprise to us to find out that there's warring groups there who want nothing to do with a bunch of infidel invaders.
So what do we do now? We're still neck deep. What do we do now?
We provide 15,000 advisors. We keep coming back to that number in Iraq. We expel the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria from that country. We maintain that security presence for the long term. Expect decades there. We maintain the same size presence in Afghanistan. Pakistan is going to remain a threat to the security of the United States for generations to come. We need to keep an eye on it. We need to have drone bases to operate from inside Afghanistan. Those are both very cheap investments in the stability of the Middle East and Afghanistan, because we are fighting a multi-generational war. And we need to have the national conversation that General Bolger is calling for. And when we employ American military force, we need to be prepared to leave the troops there for generations to come.
And if you lay it out for the American people that this is going to take 15,000, but maybe it's going to take 50,000 or whatever the reality begins to be, if you lay that out for the American people and they say, no, this is really not something we're committed to for 50 years, then what do we do?
Well, I think what we do at that point is we accept the decision of the people we work for, which is the U.S. population. Ask the people. They tend to get it right.
Thank you both for being here. It's a difficult conversation. Lieutenant General Daniel Bolger and Lieutenant Colonel John NAGL. The books are Why We Lost and Knife Fights. For more about these books and guests, to watch this and other episodes of American Forum, or to share your thoughts about this program, please visit us at millercenter.org American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next time. There we go. Thank you.